I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV Velocities in Music, the best kept secret in music reviews. We're going to head across the pond today. Across the pond, Tom. You like albums and from bands from the great country of Great Britain.
I do.
So this is a British band, Los Campesinos. They do indie rock music. They formed in 2006. It's 2013. They just came out with their 5th album, No Blues. That is an incredible amount of albums for that short of a time frame. Now this album is a almost 42-minute indie rock kind of marathon here. Tom, how would you describe this sound of No Blues?
There
aren't any blues on this album.
No, they are very straightforward about that. You know that going into it.
You really do.
I mean, if the Black Keys came out with an album called No Blues, I'd slap Dan Howard back in the face because come on, false advertising.
False advertising. So this is true advertising.
It is. You get a lot of authentic kind of indie rock sound, which what does that really even mean anymore? I don't know. But just your kind of guitar based, not super heavy, a little bit of a focus on the vocals, which brings in kind of an indie pop.
Yeah, it definitely has some electronic backings too, which I think there's the general sense of optimistic mood.
Yeah,
the upbeat tempos that they have. I mean, I just feel like a lot of that leads it to kind of more of the indie pop with just more rock based instruments. There's a lot of guitar riffs here, a lot of really decent guitar melodies, driving bass, and then just the organic drums. You don't have a drum machine. In 2013, to not have a drum machine is actually uncommon.
it's really true.
It is what it is. So I think that the presentation of this is along the lines of bands like, I think vocally the lead vocalist here reminds me a lot of Matt from Matt and Kim. But there's also like their sound. I think we were talking, Tom. It reminds me of Cloud Cold,
Rogue Wave,
newer Rogue Wave, yeah for sure. So along that lines of upbeat pop music.
I totally agree. From there, you kind of, let's just jump into this right now. The first thing you hear about this album is the production.
Oh man, it's stark. It's like you put it on and it just doesn't sound as good as other albums.
That's normally a complaint that I would save more towards the end of the review.
But it's the most obvious.
But it is the most obvious aspect because you know what production style the album is going for before you understand the songwriting.
And in 2013,
it's the entry point.
And so much of indie rock music uses that term. Oh, it's lo-fi. It's lo-fi as a production style. Yeah, I get that. But in 2013, you can't just record an album that's lo-fi. Even a lo-fi album is sculpted to sound lo-fi. Yeah. This was not sculpted to sound lo-fi.
It just sounds lazy.
It was written to not be a lo-fi record or lo-fi produced record, and therefore should not be produced anywhere near that.
And the way you can tell is how the production works with the instrumentation and the songwriting, because production, I've said this so many times, is not a one-size-fits-all thing. Yeah, that lo-fi kind of noisy approach worked for bands like Pavement because they wrote songs where the production style actually catered to that brought authenticity. But here, you actually have a lot more complex instrumentation and many layers that you simply can't hear as well because they're so muddled. A lot of it has to do with the mixing, the production of the individual tracks, even as far as the panning. Right when I put this album on, everything feels like it's squashed into the center channel. I don't get separation horizontally in either of my ears. I don't get a stereo feel from it at all.
I totally agree. And I actually think that so let's just get this out of the way too. Tom and I had very different experiences with the record. Now, I kind of felt like after a few listens to this album, I was like, this is decent. There's a lot of things I like, but it doesn't blow me away, which is typically a low 70s sort of album. Like really diving into this album and trying to understand how they built the album, analyzing the listening experience from start to finish, what I liked, what I didn't like. I actually came down on this album even more, and part of the reason, we'll segue from what you were just talking about, the production just, it prevents dynamic contrast. These guys are doing a ton of layering in the songwriting. They put guitar melodies and bass lines and electronic melodies and lots of vocal layers on top of each other, and they're always kind of moving them and shuffling them around to build this kind of neat indie rock sound that they're going for. The problem is whenever you throw a lot of layers like that and your production doesn't provide for a lot of distinction between those layers, it sounds like a muddy mess, and that is what a lot of these songs sound like to me, especially on the back half of this album. Tracks like, just pretty much the last 3 tracks, Let It Spill, The Time Before the Last Time, and Selling Rope. Those tracks just really, I just felt sounded messy. There wasn't a lot of distinction, and I think that the vocalist has enough of a unique voice that you could hear a lot of the vocal melodies, but other than that, a lot of things blended together. Now, production, in particularly mixing, is only part of the problem, I think.
Yeah.
What I found is that there really just wasn't enough of a difference between the verses and the choruses dynamically. The ideas that they're presenting might be different, and I enjoyed the different ideas that they were going for, but I thought that the overall effect on the listening experience just made it so that these tracks started to sound the same because they weren't providing a lot of difference between the verses and the choruses.
And I absolutely can't disagree with you on those points. Well, obviously we agree on the production, but it's kind of about how that affects your listening experience. And I am kind of a heckler for production. I will admit my score definitely would have been higher if the production was to what my standards would expect for an album of this genre and what they're going for instrumentally. And I do agree that after a while the tracks do kind of sound the same in terms of style. It gets a little bit repetitive as far as what they're trying to accomplish. Yeah. But what I realized after listening to this album, because after first 1 or 2 listens, I was kind of in the low 70s as well. I was like, this is a pretty good indie rock record, but nothing.
Pretty staple, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like it.
But just as I continued listening to it, I fell in love with several of the tracks. I've picked 5 of the 10 tracks as track picks because I simply couldn't narrow it down. Those songs were getting stuck in my head. I love the vocal melodies. I love the way the instrumentals back that up. Better production would have enhanced that, but I still got the idea of the songwriting enough to make me really love those tracks. And the other tracks that I didn't like quite as much, I still enjoyed. They didn't ruin the listening experience for me, but those highlights really helped move the album along. Especially, I picked the first 3 tracks. I think it starts fantastically. Yeah. It slumps a little bit at the end. I agree that the last few tracks don't really live up to what's...
The front half of this album is actually quite good. I really like track 2, What Death Leaves Behind. Track 4, Cemetery Gaze, obviously, referencing a band we may know and love. But yeah, the front of the album actually does do a very good job of presenting the ideas. The thing with me is that, and that's where I kind of saw the problems that that bothered me with the songwriting, is that they just kind of reuse those same themes and motifs over and over again throughout the rest of the album, and they didn't really reinvent the sound. They didn't give me a reason to want to listen to the end of the album. If you do that, I generally don't like the record.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's just, I don't review, unfortunately, I just always get to this point where it's like, I feel like, yeah, I may like 1 or 2 tracks, but it's about the album to me, and this album just doesn't end well. And there's so many things here, there's so many problems going on that I think they could have cleaned up, that I think you could make a case that while there is some good tracks here, it really comes down to whether it bothers you or not.
It's true. It's just, I think that some of those aspects are absolutely undeniable, but it's just how it affects your listening experience. For me, I approach it from a standpoint where you're absolutely right that as a cohesive album, this isn't really an overwhelmingly positive musical statement, but I think that there are just enough individual tracks in there to push it along and make this a really enjoyable experience for me.
Bit of a polarizing effort for us to take down here. What are you giving this?
I'm giving it even 80.
Okay, I'm going 68.
All right.
That is a huge gap. I mean, Tom and I feel like if we're 5 points apart, that's a pretty large gap. But actually, we're 12 points apart here. Puts this in the mid-70s here, which actually I think is pretty fair considering how polarizing the effect was. Now, that means that you guys get to weigh in on this one. What did you think of No Blues? Have you listened to this album? If you have, please go. If you haven't, please go out and do so and let us know where you fell. Are you of the opinion that the songwriting was really good and that you fell in love with it, or did some of the production and songwriting issues bother you and you ended up closer to where I'm at? We're really interested to validate our own opinions, because this is really about what we all think, and the purpose is to get discussion going, not about where your opinions truly lie.
But it's also about which one of us is right and which one's wrong. Right?
You make a good point there. You make a good point. Let us know what you guys thought at www.velocitiesandmusic.com or youtube.com/velocitiesandmusic. As always, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and let us know what albums you'd like to see us review on this channel. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, moving music critique forward.
I'll be